The check for $15,000 was made out to something called the Children's Future Foundation, and Maria stared at it through the glass door of David's home office, her heart hammering against her ribs. $15,000 from their joint savings account, gone to yet another one of her husband's charitable causes, while she'd been calculating whether they could afford to replace their dying washing machine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. David Castellanos had always been generous to a fault, or so Maria had believed during their 12 years of marriage. The man who brought her coffee in bed every Sunday morning, who never forgot their anniversary, who coached Little League Baseball in his spare time, was also apparently writing checks to worthy causes with the frequency of a lottery winner. The Wellness Initiative, Hope for Tomorrow, Second Chances Foundation, the list went on, each one tugging at heartstrings and opening David's wallet. Maria had been proud of her husband's philanthropy, had bragged about it to her friends at the elementary school where she taught third grade. While other husbands spent money on golf equipment or expensive cars, David was out there making the world a better place. She'd felt lucky to be married to someone so conscious of others' suffering, so willing to put his money where his values were. Standing in the doorway of their Riverside home that October morning, watching David's printer churn out another bank transfer confirmation, Maria felt the first real crack in the foundation of everything she'd believed about her marriage. The Children's Future Foundation was the third large donation this month, following a $10,000 contribution to Urban Youth Outreach and an $8,000 payment to Educational Excellence Now. Over $30,000 in charitable giving in 4 weeks, while Maria had been buying generic cereal and stretching ground beef with lentils to make their grocery budget work. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd discovered this latest act of generosity while looking for the warranty information on their broken dishwasher, a machine David had insisted they couldn't afford to repair professionally. Fix it yourself, he'd suggested cheerfully, handing her a screwdriver and a YouTube tutorial. The man who thought nothing of writing five-figure checks to charity couldn't spare $300 for a repair service. David emerged from the kitchen carrying his thermal coffee mug and leather briefcase, dressed in the navy suit that made his salt and pepper hair look distinguished. At 45, he maintained the athletic build that had first caught Maria's attention at a mutual friend's barbecue 13 years ago. He still turned heads at school functions and neighborhood gatherings, still carried himself with the easy confidence that had made her feel chosen, special, grateful to be his wife. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple as he passed, running late for the Morrison depositions. The Morrison depositions were part of a high-profile divorce case that David's family law practice had been handling for months, the kind of contentious custody battle that generated billable hours like a slot machine paying out coins. David had been working long evenings and weekends on the case, often coming home exhausted and stressed about the complexities of protecting children caught in the crossfire of their parents' bitter separation. Maria held up the bank transfer confirmation. "David, we need to talk about this." He glanced at the paper in her hand, and for just a moment, she saw something flicker across his features. Surprise, perhaps? Or was it annoyance at being caught? "What about it?" he asked, adjusting his tie with practiced casualness. $15,000, David, to the Children's Future Foundation, while our dishwasher is held together with duct tape and prayers. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Maria, we've discussed this. My charitable giving is important to me. It's tax deductible and it helps people who are less fortunate than we are. I thought you supported my values." The subtle shift in his tone, the way he'd reframed her concern as a character flaw on her part, was so smooth that Maria almost fell into the familiar pattern of apologizing for questioning him. Almost. Instead, she found herself studying his face with new attention, noticing details that had previously escaped her scrutiny. "I do support helping people," she said carefully, "but $33,000 in 1 month, David, that's more than I make in half a year. Don't you think we should discuss major financial decisions like this?" The question seemed to genuinely surprise him. "We do discuss them. I tell you about my charitable work all the time." Maria felt a strange disconnect, as if she were hearing their conversations through someone else's ears. David did mention his philanthropy regularly, but always in broad, emotional terms that discouraged detailed questions. He talked about helping underprivileged children, supporting families in crisis, funding educational initiatives that would break cycles of poverty. The specifics, she realized, had always been vague. Which children? She asked suddenly. What families? Where exactly does this money go? David checked his watch with theatrical impatience. Maria, I really don't have time for an interrogation right now. The Morrison case is extremely time sensitive, and I can't be late. We'll discuss this tonight, okay? He kissed her cheek again and headed for the garage, leaving Maria standing in their hallway with a growing sense of unease. In 12 years of marriage, David had never been evasive about his work or his finances. He'd always been proud of his success as an attorney, eager to share the details of interesting cases, transparent about their joint investments and retirement planning. This sudden reluctance to discuss his charitable activities felt profoundly out of character. After David left, Maria returned to his office and studied the bank transfer confirmation more carefully. The routing number led to a bank she didn't recognize, and the account number seemed unusually long. Most concerning was the memo line, which read simply, CS Foundation Legal Support Services. Legal support services seemed like an odd description for a children's charity, but perhaps it referred to advocacy work or policy initiatives. Maria opened David's laptop, knowing his password was their wedding date combined with their daughter's initials. Elena Castellanos, now 16 and spending her junior year as an exchange student in Barcelona, was their miracle baby after years of infertility struggles. David's computer background was still the photo from Elena's departure at the airport, her dark hair gleaming in the terminal lighting as she hugged them goodbye with the excitement of someone about to embark on the adventure of a lifetime. David's browser history revealed multiple visits to various foundation websites, all of them professionally designed and emotionally compelling. Children's Future Foundation featured photos of smiling kids in classrooms, testimonials from grateful families, and mission statements about breaking cycles of poverty through educational support. Urban Youth Outreach showcased after-school programs and mentorship initiatives. Educational Excellence Now highlighted scholarship recipients and their success stories. Everything looked legitimate, inspiring even, but Maria found herself looking for details that had never seemed important before. Contact information was limited to web forms and post office boxes. Staff listings included first names and titles, but no professional backgrounds or photos. Financial transparency, when mentioned at all, was vague about specific allocations and administrative costs. A memory surfaced from 3 months ago when Maria had suggested they donate to the local food bank instead of buying expensive gifts for Elena's host family. David had dismissed the idea immediately, explaining that he preferred to support organizations that addressed root causes rather than temporary symptoms. He'd written a check to something called Sustainable Futures Initiative instead, and Maria had felt chastened by his superior understanding of effective philanthropy. Now she wondered if she'd been trained, subtly and consistently, to stop asking questions about money. David handled their finances with the expertise of someone who understood investments and tax implications far better than an elementary school teacher ever could. He'd taken pride in protecting her from the complexities of their financial planning, just as he protected their clients from the intricacies of family law. It was part of what had made her feel secure in their marriage, this sense that David's competence covered areas where her own knowledge was limited. But sitting in his office, surrounded by diplomas and awards that testified to his professional success, Maria felt the first stirring of a possibility she'd never seriously considered. What if David's expertise was being used to hide things rather than to protect her? What if his dismissal of her financial concerns wasn't about her lack of sophistication, but about his need for her not to look too closely? Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Carmen. "Lunch today? I have gossip about the Henderson divorce." Carmen worked as a paralegal for a different family law firm in town, and she often had insights into cases that overlapped with David's work. Maria had always enjoyed these conversations, finding it fascinating to hear about the legal system from someone who saw it from the inside. Today, however, the mention of divorce proceedings sent an uncomfortable chill down her spine. Maria texted back quickly, "Definitely. Giuseppe's at noon?" She spent the morning grading math tests and trying to concentrate on her students' progress with fractions, but her thoughts kept drifting to bank transfers and foundation websites that seemed designed more to inspire than to inform. Giuseppe's was crowded with the lunch rush when Maria arrived, but Carmen had secured their usual corner booth. At 38, Carmen was 4 years younger than Maria, but seemed decades more cynical about relationships and financial security. Her divorce from Elena's godfather had been finalized 2 years ago, a process that had opened Maria's eyes to the complex financial maneuvering that could happen when marriages dissolved. "You look terrible," Carmen said without preamble, studying Maria's face over her antipasto salad. "What's wrong?" Maria hesitated, unsure how to articulate the growing unease that had been building all morning. "David's been making a lot of charitable donations lately, big ones, from our joint account." Carmen's eyebrows rose. "Define big." $33,000 in the last month. Carmen choked on her iced tea. $33,000? Maria, that's more than most people's annual charity budget. What kind of organizations? Maria pulled out her phone and showed Carmen the list she'd compiled from David's browser history. Children's Future Foundation, Urban Youth Outreach, Educational Excellence Now, Sustainable Futures Initiative, and half a dozen others, all focused on helping kids and families, all professionally presented, all requiring significant financial commitments. Carmen studied the list with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years processing legal documents. "Have you heard of any of these?" she asked finally. Maria shook her head. "That's what's bothering me. David's always been involved with local charities, things we could see the impact of. These are all national organizations, or at least they claim to be. Can I see the bank transfer information?" Carmen's voice had taken on the careful tone she used when reviewing contracts for red flags. Maria showed her the confirmation printout, watching as Carmen's expression grew increasingly concerned. "This routing number," she said slowly, "this isn't a standard banking institution. It's what we call a trust account, usually used for legal settlements or estate management." "Legal settlements?" Maria felt her stomach drop. Carmen nodded grimly. "The kind of account attorneys use when they're managing money on behalf of clients, or when they're making payments that need to be processed through legal channels rather than direct transfers." Maria stared at the paper in her hands as if it might transform into something less threatening. "But these are charities, Carmen. I've seen their websites. They have mission statements and success stories." Carmen pulled out her own phone and began typing rapidly. "Let me look something up." After a few minutes of searching, she turned her screen toward Maria. "Here's the problem. I can't find any IRS records for most of these organizations. No 990 forms, no Charity Navigator ratings, no GuideStar listings. For legitimate nonprofits, especially ones receiving 5-figure donations, this information should be readily available." The restaurant noise seemed to fade as Maria processed this information. "But David researches everything," she said weakly. "He wouldn't just hand over money without verifying that it's going to legitimate causes." Carmen reached across the table and covered Maria's hand with her own. "Honey, what if David isn't the one being deceived?" The drive home felt surreal, as if Maria were watching someone else navigate familiar streets while grappling with impossible possibilities. David had been her anchor for 12 years, the steady presence who handled complex decisions while she focused on teaching and raising Elena. The idea that he might be systematically lying to her felt as absurd as discovering that gravity worked in reverse. But Carmen's final words kept echoing in her mind. "In my experience, when someone starts hiding financial activity from their spouse, there's usually a very personal reason. And in family law, the most common personal reason involves an ex-spouse or an extramarital relationship." David's ex-wife, Natasha, had been a painful chapter in their early marriage. The divorce had been finalized just 6 months before David met Maria, and the custody arrangements for David's son Marcus had been a source of ongoing tension for years. Marcus was now 22 and finishing his final year at Stanford, a brilliant young man who'd inherited his father's analytical mind and his mother's artistic sensibilities. Maria had tried to build a relationship with her stepson, but the logistics of his living primarily with his mother in San Francisco had limited their opportunities for bonding. David made regular trips north to maintain his connection with Marcus, and Maria had always admired his commitment to staying involved in his son's life despite the geographical challenges. But what if those trips involved more than paternal duty?
What if David's ongoing connection to his ex-wife extended beyond co-parenting arrangements? Maria pulled into their driveway and sat in the car for several minutes, trying to reconcile the David she'd known and loved with the possibility that he was funding his ex-wife's activities through fake charitable donations. Inside the house, Maria returned to David's office with new purpose. If Carmen was right about the trust accounts and missing charity records, then David's computer might contain evidence of whatever he was really funding. She opened his email program and began searching for correspondence related to the various foundations, but found nothing beyond automated donation confirmations and generic thank you messages. His financial software was password protected, but Maria remembered David mentioning that he used the same security protocols for all his professional accounts. After several attempts, she gained access to a detailed record of their joint finances that painted a disturbing picture of systematic deception. The charitable donations stretched back nearly 2 years, growing larger and more frequent over time. The total amount was staggering, over $200,000 transferred to various foundation accounts, all while David had been expressing concern about their household budget and suggesting that Maria take on private tutoring to supplement her teaching income. The pattern of giving coincided almost perfectly with periods when David had been traveling to San Francisco for visits with Marcus. Each trip seemed to be followed within days by a substantial donation to one of his carefully curated list of charitable causes. The correlation was too consistent to be coincidental, but Maria still couldn't understand the mechanism by which her husband was funneling money to his ex-wife through fake charities. Her phone rang, startling her out of her detective work. The caller ID showed David's office number, and Maria felt a spike of guilt as if she'd been caught snooping through someone else's private belongings. "Hi, sweetheart." David's voice was warm and familiar. "How's your day going?" "Fine," Maria replied, trying to keep her voice normal. "Just catching up on some grading." David chuckled, the glamorous life of an educator. "Listen, I'm going to be late tonight. The Morrison case is heating up, and we need to prepare for some emergency motions. Don't wait up for me." The Morrison case again. Maria found herself paying attention to details she'd previously ignored. "How long has this case been going on, David? It feels like you've been working on it for months." There was a brief pause before David responded. "Complex custody situations take time to resolve, especially when there are significant assets involved. We want to make sure that children's interests are protected above all else." "Of course," Maria said. "I'll leave dinner in the refrigerator. Love you." After David hung up, Maria sat staring at the phone in her hand. In 12 years of marriage, her husband had never given her reason to doubt his honesty or question his commitment to their family. But the evidence spread across his computer screen told a different story, one that suggested David was leading a double life with the skill of someone who'd been practicing deception for years. Maria closed the financial software and cleared the browser history, then spent the rest of the afternoon researching family law procedures and trust account regulations. What she learned painted an increasingly disturbing picture of how attorney trust accounts could be used to disguise personal payments as legitimate legal expenses. The Children's Future Foundation, she discovered, was indeed a registered nonprofit organization, but its primary purpose was providing legal support services to families involved in custody disputes. Urban Youth Outreach offered similar services, focusing on fathers seeking increased visitation rights with their children. Each of David's charitable organizations, when examined closely, turned out to be a legal services provider specializing in family law matters. The emotional appeals and success stories on their websites weren't fabricated, but they weren't about feeding hungry children or providing scholarships either. They were about helping divorced parents navigate complex custody arrangements and modifying existing support agreements. The realization hit Maria like a physical blow. David wasn't funding generic charitable causes.
He was paying for legal services that would benefit his ex-wife in their ongoing custody and support arrangements. Every dollar he donated to help underprivileged children was actually going toward legal representation that could potentially reduce his own financial obligations or modify custody agreements in Natasha's favor. But why would David voluntarily fund his ex-wife's legal costs? The only answer that made sense was that he was getting something in return, something valuable enough to justify secretly spending over $200,000 of their joint assets. Maria spent the evening mechanically preparing lesson plans while her mind raced through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. When David finally came home at nearly 11 o'clock, Maria was waiting in the living room with a cup of tea and what she hoped was a casual expression. He looked tired, but satisfied, the way he always did after a productive day of complex legal work. "The Morrison case is finally moving in the right direction," he said, settling beside her on the couch. "We might be able to reach a settlement that protects everyone's interests." "That's wonderful," Maria replied. "Tell me about it. What makes this case so challenging?" David launched into a detailed explanation of custody disputes and asset protection that demonstrated his genuine expertise in family law. As he spoke, Maria found herself analyzing his words for hidden meanings, wondering if his professional passion for protecting families might extend to protecting his own former family at the expense of his current one. "David," she said when he paused for breath, "I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, about your charitable giving. I'd like to understand more about how these organizations work, maybe get involved myself." David's expression shifted subtly. "That's thoughtful, Maria, but most of these organizations work with legal professionals rather than volunteers. Your time would be better spent on local causes where you could have direct impact." The dismissal was gentle but firm, designed to redirect her interest without seeming to forbid her involvement. It was the same tone David used when explaining why she shouldn't worry about their investment portfolio or tax planning, the voice of a protective husband who wanted to shield his wife from complexities she couldn't fully understand. "But what if I could understand?" Maria asked. "What if I took some business courses, learned more about nonprofit management? I have summers off, and Elena won't be back from Barcelona until next year." David studied her face with the careful attention he usually reserved for hostile witnesses. "Maria, sweetheart, you're already doing important work with your teaching. Why complicate your life with business courses and nonprofit bureaucracy?" "Because I want to understand what my husband cares about," she replied. "I want to be able to contribute to causes that matter to you." The response seemed to satisfy him, and David pulled her closer on the couch. "You contribute in ways you don't even realize," he said, kissing the top of her head. "Your compassion and your dedication to helping kids, that's what inspired me to get involved with children's charities in the first place." Maria felt a stab of guilt at the sincerity in his voice. What if she was wrong about the charitable donations? What if her suspicions were the product of too much time alone and too many conversations with her cynical sister? David had never been anything but loving and supportive, and his commitment to helping disadvantaged children seemed entirely consistent with the man she'd married. But as they went through their evening routine of checking locks and turning off lights, Maria found herself noticing details that had previously escaped her attention. The way David's phone was always face down on the nightstand, even though he'd never been secretive about calls or messages. The fact that his San Francisco trips were always planned with very short notice, making it impossible for her to arrange time off to join him. The gentle but consistent way he discouraged her interest in their finances, even though she had a master's degree in education administration and was perfectly capable of understanding investment strategies and tax planning. Lying in bed beside her sleeping husband, Maria stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile the David she'd known for 12 years with the possibility that he was systematically deceiving her. The man who brought her coffee every Sunday morning, who never forgot their anniversary, who had supported her through the difficult years when they'd struggled to conceive. The father who called Elena every week in Barcelona, who sent care packages filled with her favorite American snacks and magazines. The husband who still held her hand during movies and left love notes in her lunch bag. But even as she cataloged David's virtues, Maria couldn't shake the image of those bank transfers and trust accounts, the carefully choreographed charitable donations that coincided with visits to his ex-wife. Tomorrow, she decided, she would start asking the kinds of questions that David had trained her not to ask. She would stop accepting his protective dismissals and start demanding the transparency that any wife deserved from her husband of 12 years. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating, like standing at the edge of a cliff with no clear view of what lay below. But Maria had spent 2 decades teaching children to think critically and question assumptions, and it was time to apply those same principles to her own life. If David was hiding something, she would find it. And if he wasn't, then her investigation would simply confirm what she'd always believed about the man she'd chosen to share her life with.
Either way, the days of blind trust were over. Maria closed her eyes and began planning her strategy, feeling more awake and alert than she had in months. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of discovering whether her marriage was built on love and mutual respect or on one partner's skill at manipulating the other's trusting nature. The clock on the nightstand showed 2:17 a.m. when Maria finally fell asleep, her dreams filled with bank statements and legal documents that transformed into children's artwork before dissolving into nothing at all. Maria woke before her alarm, her body tense with the kind of nervous energy that usually preceded parent-teacher conferences or difficult conversations with the school principal. David was already in the shower, his morning routine as predictable as sunrise. Coffee first, then shower, then 20 minutes reviewing case files while eating toast with exactly 2 tablespoons of strawberry jam. The normalcy of it all felt jarring against the backdrop of her growing suspicions. How could someone maintain such ordinary domestic habits while potentially orchestrating elaborate financial deceptions? Maria dressed quickly in her favorite navy dress, the one that made her feel confident during challenging days, and headed downstairs to intercept David before he left for work. He was standing at the kitchen counter with his tablet, scrolling through legal documents while mechanically eating his breakfast. The morning light streaming through their bay window highlighted the silver threading through his dark hair, and Maria felt a familiar tug of attraction mixed with uncertainty. This was the man who had held her hand through 3 miscarriages before Elena was born, who had painted her toenails when she was too pregnant to reach her feet, who still kissed her goodbye every morning, even when they'd argued the night before. "David," she said, settling beside him with her own coffee, "I've been thinking more about those charities you support. Could you show me some of their annual reports? I'd love to see the impact of your donations."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
David's fingers paused over his tablet screen for just a moment before resuming their steady scrawling. Most of these organizations are quite small, Maria. They don't produce the kind of comprehensive reports you'd see from United Way or similar groups. But surely they must provide some documentation, she pressed. Tax filings, program summaries, financial transparency reports? David set down his tablet and turned to face her fully, his expression patient but slightly strained. "Sweetheart, I appreciate your interest, but I've already done the due diligence on these organizations. They're legitimate, they're effective, and they're helping kids who desperately need support. Isn't that what matters?" The gentle condescension in his tone sparked something rebellious in Maria's chest. "Of course that's what matters," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "But as your wife, I'd like to understand where our money is going, especially such significant amounts." David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Our money? Maria immediately recognized the trap she'd walked into. David earned nearly 4 times her teaching salary, and he'd always been generous about referring to their finances as shared assets. But his subtle emphasis on the pronoun suggested that her equal claim to their joint resources might be more theoretical than practical. "Yes, our money," she said firmly. "The money from our joint savings account, which includes my salary and my contributions to our household." David studied her face with the calculating expression she'd seen him use during particularly contentious divorce proceedings. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right, and I apologize for implying otherwise. Why don't we sit down this weekend and go through all our financial commitments together? You should have complete transparency about our charitable giving." The concession felt like a victory, but Maria sensed something performative about David's contrition. His agreement came too easily, with too much apparent sincerity, as if he were managing a difficult client rather than responding to his wife's legitimate concerns. "Thank you," she said. "I'd appreciate that." David kissed her cheek and gathered his briefcase, but Maria noticed that he took his tablet with him rather than leaving it on the counter as usual. After he left, Maria called in a personal day at school and drove to the public library downtown. If David was reluctant to share information about his charitable activities, she would conduct her own research using resources he couldn't monitor or control. The librarian, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia, who'd helped Maria research lesson plans in the past, seemed intrigued by the unusual request for assistance with nonprofit investigation techniques.
You're looking to verify the legitimacy of charitable organizations? Patricia asked, leading Maria to a bank of computers reserved for research purposes. That's actually more complex than most people realize. There are several databases we can check, but you'll need specific information to get meaningful results. Maria provided the names of David's favorite charities, along with the bank routing numbers Carmen had identified as unusual. Patricia's fingers flew over the keyboard with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades helping people navigate information systems. What they discovered over the next 2 hours painted a picture that was both more innocent and more disturbing than Maria had anticipated. The Children's Future Foundation was indeed a legitimate nonprofit organization, registered in Nevada with proper IRS documentation and annual filings. But when Patricia pulled up their detailed financial reports, a troubling pattern emerged. The organization's primary revenue source was individual donations from a small number of high-net-worth contributors, and their primary expense was legal services provided to families involved in complex custody disputes. Here's what's interesting, Patricia said, pointing to a line item in the foundation's most recent tax filing. They spent 87% of their donations on legal fees last year, with only 13% going to direct services, like counseling or family support programs. For most child-focused charities, you'd expect to see those percentages reversed. Maria stared at the screen, trying to process the implications. So, the money really is going to help families with legal problems? Technically, yes, Patricia replied. But look at this. She clicked to another section of the filing. The foundation's board of directors includes several family law attorneys, and their legal service providers are all based in California, specifically in the San Francisco Bay Area. The geographical connection sent a chill down Maria's spine. David's ex-wife lived in San Francisco, and his son Marcus was finishing college at Stanford, less than an hour's drive from the city. The timing of David's charitable donations, which coincided with his visits to see Marcus, suddenly took on a more sinister significance. Can you tell me more about how these legal service payments work? Maria asked. Patricia navigated to another database and pulled up regulatory information about attorney trust accounts and third-party payment arrangements. What she found was a sophisticated system that would allow someone to fund another person's legal representation without leaving obvious paper trails connecting the donor to the recipient. Essentially, Patricia explained, someone could donate money to a legitimate charity, claim a tax deduction for charitable giving, and have that money used to pay legal fees on behalf of someone else. The charity serves as a buffer, making it difficult to trace the ultimate beneficiary. It's not illegal, but it's ethically questionable, especially if the donor has a personal relationship with the person receiving the legal services. Maria felt sick as the full scope of David's deception became clear. He wasn't just hiding his financial support for his ex-wife, he was structuring it in a way that provided him with tax benefits while making detection nearly impossible. The charities weren't fake, but they were functioning as elaborate money laundering operations for divorced parents who wanted to continue supporting their former spouses without admitting it to their current partners. Is there a way to find out specifically who received legal services funded by these donations? Maria asked. Patricia shook her head regretfully. That information would be protected by attorney-client privilege and charity privacy policies. You'd need a court order or cooperation from the organization itself to access those records. Maria thanked Patricia and drove home in a daze, her mind reeling from the implications of what she'd discovered. David wasn't having an affair with his ex-wife, at least not in the traditional sense, but he was maintaining a financial relationship with Natasha that he'd concealed from Maria for at least 2 years. The question was whether this support was motivated by genuine concern for his son's welfare or by more complicated emotional entanglements that David wasn't ready to acknowledge. Back at home, Maria found herself walking through their house with new eyes, noting details that had previously seemed insignificant. The family photos in their living room included several pictures of Marcus at various stages of his development, but none of David's ex-wife. David's home office contained thick files labeled with case names, but nothing that obviously related to his own family's legal history. Their joint calendar, which Maria had access to through their shared Google account, showed David's trips to San Francisco as simple notations like "Visit Marcus," with no additional details about duration or activities. But there were subtle signs of deception that Maria had trained herself to overlook. The way David's mood always improved after his San Francisco trips, as if some burden had been lifted. The expensive gifts he brought back for Maria, jewelry and perfumes that seemed chosen more to assuage guilt than to express affection. The gradual increase in his charitable giving that had coincided with Marcus's college years, when legal fees related to tuition support and custody modifications would naturally be higher. Maria's phone buzzed with a text from Elena in Barcelona. "Mom, can we video chat tonight? I have news about my host family situation." The timing felt surreal. Here was her daughter navigating complex social relationships in a foreign country, while Maria was discovering that her own marriage might be built on elaborate financial deceptions. She texted back quickly, "Of course, sweetheart. 8 o'clock our time?" The prospect of talking to Elena provided a welcome distraction from her mounting anxiety about David's activities, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about what kind of marriage she and David were modeling for their daughter. Elena had grown up watching her parents navigate what appeared to be a stable, respectful partnership built on mutual trust and shared values. How would she react to learning that her stepfather had been systematically lying to her mother about significant financial commitments? Maria spent the afternoon researching family law in California, trying to understand what kind of ongoing legal issues might require the level of financial support David was providing. What she learned was both educational and disturbing. Custody agreements could be modified based on changes in financial circumstances, educational needs, or living arrangements. Support payments could be adjusted if one parent's income increased significantly or if unexpected expenses arose. Most relevant to David's situation, college expenses could become the subject of extensive litigation if parents disagreed about responsibility for tuition, housing, and other costs. Marcus was attending Stanford, one of the most expensive universities in the country. If David's divorce agreement included provisions for shared educational costs, and if Natasha had been seeking modifications to increase David's financial responsibility, the legal fees could easily reach the levels that David's charitable donations were funding. But why would David agree to pay for Natasha's legal representation in a dispute against himself? The only answer that made sense was that he wasn't actually opposing her requests for increased support. Maria's research into family law led her to a disturbing realization about the power dynamics in her own marriage. David's expertise in divorce proceedings gave him sophisticated tools for hiding assets and manipulating financial disclosures. His knowledge of legal loopholes and trust account regulations meant that he could structure deceptive transactions in ways that would be nearly impossible for a layperson to detect or challenge. Most troubling, his professional reputation for integrity and his role as a respected family law attorney provided perfect cover for behavior that would seem suspicious coming from someone without his credentials. At 6 o'clock, David called to say he'd be late again. More emergency motions in the Morrison case, he explained, his voice carrying the familiar mix of frustration and professional excitement that always accompanied complex legal challenges. Maria found herself analyzing his tone for signs of deception, wondering if the Morrison case even existed or if it was simply a convenient excuse for activities he couldn't explain to his wife. "Don't wait dinner for me," David continued. "This case is requiring some unusual research, and I want to make sure we're fully prepared for tomorrow's hearing." The mention of research made Maria's pulse quicken. "What kind of research?" she asked, trying to sound casually interested rather than suspicious. "Just precedent analysis for custody modification procedures," David replied smoothly. "Nothing too exciting for non-lawyers." After David hung up, Maria realized that he'd mentioned custody modification, the exact legal issue that her afternoon research had identified as the most likely reason for extensive legal fees in cases involving college-age children. The coincidence felt too precise to be accidental, as if David were providing just enough detail to satisfy her curiosity while revealing more than he intended about his actual activities. Maria's video call with Elena provided a temporary escape from her growing anxiety about David's deceptions. Her daughter looked radiant in the Madrid apartment she shared with her host family, her dark hair longer than Maria remembered, and her Spanish pronunciation noticeably improved. Elena's news was that her host parents were getting divorced, a development that was complicating her living situation but also providing her with unexpected insights into international family law. "It's fascinating, Mom," Elena said, her face bright with intellectual curiosity. "The legal system here is so different from what Dad deals with. Property division follows completely different principles, and custody arrangements are much more flexible." Elena's casual reference to David's work sent a stab of guilt through Maria's chest. Her daughter still saw David as the dedicated family law attorney who fought to protect children caught in their parents' conflicts. The possibility that David might be using his legal expertise to deceive his own family would shatter Elena's idealized view of her stepfather. "How are things with you and Dad?" Elena asked, her expression growing more serious. "You both seemed a little tense during our last call." Maria forced a bright smile. "We're fine, sweetheart. Just the usual stress of work and maintaining the house while you're away." Elena nodded, but Maria could see the thoughtful expression that meant her daughter was processing subtext and drawing her own conclusions. After they hung up, Maria sat in her kitchen surrounded by the comfortable familiarity of home while feeling increasingly like a stranger in her own life. The house where she'd lived for 8 years, the marriage that had defined her identity for over a decade, the financial security she'd taken for granted, all of it suddenly felt contingent on David's continued willingness to maintain his elaborate deceptions. But Maria was no longer the trusting wife who accepted her husband's explanations without question. Her afternoon at the library had provided her with tools and knowledge that David couldn't control or manipulate. She understood now how charitable donations could be used to disguise personal payments, how attorney trust accounts could obscure financial relationships, how professional reputation could provide cover for ethically questionable behavior. More importantly, she'd identified the specific vulnerabilities in David's deception that could be exploited to uncover the full truth about his relationship with his ex-wife. Tomorrow, Maria decided, she would begin the process of gathering evidence that could force David to choose between honesty and continued deception. She would stop being the accommodating wife who accepted reassurances without verification and start being the investigative partner who deserved complete transparency about their shared financial future. The decision felt both empowering and terrifying, like stepping across a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. But Maria had spent 20 years teaching children to question assumptions and think critically about information, and it was time to apply those same principles to her own marriage. If David was hiding something, she would find it. And if he wasn't, then her investigation would simply confirm what she'd always believed about the man she'd chosen to share her life with. Either way, the days of blind trust were over. Maria turned off the lights and headed upstairs, feeling more determined than she had in months. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, and she intended to be ready for whatever she discovered. Maria spent the next morning implementing a strategy she'd developed during her sleepless hours the night before. If David was funding his ex-wife's legal representation through charitable donations, there would be communication records that could prove the connection. Email correspondence, phone calls, document transfers, all the digital breadcrumbs that even sophisticated attorneys sometimes left behind when they thought their activities were beyond scrutiny. David's computer was password protected, but Maria knew his security habits from years of marriage. He used variations of the same password for most accounts, usually incorporating Elena's birthday and their anniversary date in predictable patterns. Within 20 minutes, she'd gained access to his email accounts, his calendar application, and his document storage system. What she found was a masterclass in careful operational security mixed with telling oversights. David's primary email account contained no correspondence with Natasha or any obvious references to legal fee payments. His calendar entries for San Francisco trips were generic and uninformative. His document folders were organized with professional precision, separating client files from personal records in ways that would satisfy any ethics audit. But David had made one crucial mistake in his operational security. His secondary email account, the one he used for online shopping and newsletter subscriptions, contained automated confirmations from financial institutions that painted a detailed picture of his charitable donation activities. Bank transfer receipts, tax documentation for charitable contributions, and most damaging of all, thank you messages from the organizations that were processing his donations. The thank you messages were revealing in their specificity. Rather than generic acknowledgments, they contained detailed information about how David's contributions were being used. The Children's Future Foundation thanked him for enabling them to provide legal representation for 3 families involved in complex custody modifications. Urban Youth Outreach expressed gratitude for funding that allowed them to support fathers seeking increased visitation rights with their college-age children. Educational Excellence Now acknowledged his contribution toward legal services that helped ensure appropriate parental support for students attending prestigious universities. Each message contained just enough detail to make the connection clear without explicitly stating that David was funding his ex-wife's legal costs. But when combined with the timing of his donations and his visits to San Francisco, the pattern was unmistakable. David was not only supporting Natasha's legal representation, he was doing it systematically and with careful coordination to ensure maximum effectiveness. Maria printed copies of the most damaging correspondence and stored them in a folder she created in Elena's bedroom, the one place in the house where David never ventured without invitation. Then she began the more challenging task of documenting the financial impact of David's deceptions on their family's actual security. Their joint savings account, which had contained over $60,000 2 years ago, now held less than $15,000. Their retirement investments had remained steady, but David had significantly reduced his contributions over the past 18 months. Most concerning, David had been gradually shifting assets into accounts that bore only his name, ostensibly for tax optimization purposes, but effectively removing Maria's legal claim to funds that had been accumulated during their marriage. The financial manipulation was sophisticated, but not complete. David had been careful to maintain their joint household accounts and continue making regular deposits to cover their shared expenses. He'd been less careful about hiding the systematic drain on their savings that was funding his ex-wife's legal activities. If Maria had been paying closer attention to their financial statements, she could have detected the pattern months earlier. But David had trained her, subtly and consistently, not to question his financial management. Every time she'd expressed interest in their investment portfolio or retirement planning, he'd provided just enough information to satisfy her immediate curiosity while steering the conversation toward topics where her expertise was more relevant. He'd made her feel valued for her contributions to their household while simultaneously excluding her from decisions that affected their long-term financial security. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as the financial deception, and Maria found herself marveling at the skill with which David had managed both her perceptions and their joint assets. But admiration was quickly replaced by anger as she realized the full scope of his betrayal. He hadn't just hidden his continued financial relationship with his ex-wife, he'd compromised their marriage's financial foundation to support that relationship while making Maria complicit through her ignorance. Maria's phone rang while she was reviewing their tax returns from the previous year, trying to calculate exactly how much David had claimed in charitable deductions for donations she'd known nothing about. The caller ID showed Carmen's number, and Maria answered with more eagerness than she'd felt for any phone call in months. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Carmen said, without preamble, "about your husband's charitable activities and those trust account routing numbers. I did some checking with colleagues who handle family law cases, and I think you need to hear what I've learned." Carmen had spent her evening researching the organizations that David was supporting, using professional databases that weren't available to the general public. What she'd discovered was a network of interconnected nonprofits that specialized in providing legal services to divorced parents involved in ongoing custody and support disputes. The organizations were legitimate, but their business model was essentially to serve as intermediaries that allowed one divorced parent to fund the other's legal representation without creating obvious paper trails. "The system works like this," Carmen explained. "A divorced father who wants to maintain good relationships with his ex-wife and children can make tax-deductible donations to these charities. The charities then use those donations to pay for legal services that benefit the ex-wife in ongoing disputes about custody, support, or educational expenses. Everyone benefits. The father gets tax deductions and maintains his reputation for generosity. The ex-wife gets high-quality legal representation she might not otherwise be able to afford, and the children benefit from reduced conflict between their parents." "But what about the current spouse?" Maria asked. "The one who doesn't know that family assets are being used to support the ex-wife's legal battles." Carmen's silence stretched long enough to make Maria's stomach clench. "That's the problem," she said finally. "The current spouse is essentially subsidizing her husband's ongoing financial relationship with his ex-wife without her knowledge or consent. In some cases, it might even be considered financial fraud, especially if joint assets are being used without disclosure. Maria felt a surge of vindication mixed with nausea.
Her suspicions had been correct, but the reality was worse than she'd imagined. David wasn't just supporting his ex-wife financially, he was doing it in a way that provided him with tax benefits while concealing the transactions from his current wife. He was literally profiting from his deception while compromising their family's financial security. Carmen, she said, I need to ask you something hypothetical. If someone were to discover this kind of financial deception in their marriage, what would be their legal options? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither sister wanted to acknowledge directly. Hypothetically, Carmen replied carefully, the deceived spouse would have several options. They could demand immediate disclosure and cessation of the undisclosed payments. They could seek marriage counseling to address the trust issues and financial disagreements, or they could consult with a family law attorney about their rights regarding marital assets and potential grounds for divorce. The word divorce sent a shock through Maria's system. She'd been so focused on uncovering David's deceptions that she hadn't seriously considered what she would do with the information once she had it. The prospect of ending her 12-year marriage over charitable donations seemed simultaneously ridiculous and inevitable. But the donations weren't really the issue. The issue was the systematic lying, the financial manipulation, and the ongoing emotional relationship with his ex-wife that David had concealed from her for at least 2 years. Maria, Carmen continued, I need to ask you directly. Are you prepared to confront David with what you've discovered? Because once you accuse someone of financial deception, there's no going back to pretending everything is normal. Your marriage will either become more honest or it will end. There's usually not much middle ground. After Carmen hung up, Maria sat in Elena's bedroom, surrounded by evidence of her husband's elaborate deceptions, and tried to imagine confronting him with what she'd learned. David was a skilled attorney who'd spent decades deflecting accusations and managing hostile interrogations. He would have explanations for everything, justifications that made his behavior seem reasonable and her suspicions seem paranoid. He might even have legal documentation that technically authorized his charitable donations, making her objections appear petty and controlling. But Maria was no longer the trusting wife who could be easily manipulated by David's professional charm and superior legal knowledge. Her afternoon at the library and her conversation with Carmen had armed her with information that David couldn't dismiss or explain away. She understood now how his system worked, why he'd structured it the way he had, and what it meant for their marriage's financial and emotional foundation. More importantly, she'd identified the evidence that would force David to choose between honesty and continued deception. The email confirmations, the financial records, the pattern of donations that coincided with his visits to see Marcus, all of it painted a picture that even David's legal skills couldn't obscure or justify. Maria spent the rest of the day preparing for a confrontation that would either save her marriage or destroy it. She organized her evidence into categories that would be difficult for David to dispute or dismiss. She researched her legal rights regarding joint marital assets and undisclosed financial commitments. Most importantly, she prepared herself emotionally for the possibility that the man she'd loved and trusted for 12 years had been systematically deceiving her about fundamental aspects of their shared life. When David came home that evening, he found Maria waiting in his office with a folder full of bank statements and printed emails spread across his desk. Her expression was calm and determined, but he could see the anger burning behind her eyes. The moment had arrived for truth, consequences, and the kind of difficult conversation that would determine whether their marriage could survive the weight of his deceptions. David, Maria said quietly, we need to talk about your charitable work. And this time, I want the complete truth about where our money has really been going. David stopped in the doorway of his office, his briefcase still in his hand, taking in the scene before him with the careful assessment of a trial attorney. Maria sat behind his desk, her posture erect and confident in a way that immediately signaled this would not be another easily managed domestic disagreement. The papers spread across his workspace told their own story, and she watched his eyes move from document to document, cataloging exactly how much she'd discovered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt charged with the weight of impending revelation, like the stillness before a thunderstorm breaks.
David set his briefcase down slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, then walked to the chair across from his own desk and sat down as if he were the visitor in his own office. "Where would you like me to begin?" he asked, his voice carrying none of the defensive bluster Maria had expected. The calm acceptance in his tone was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. It suggested that David had been preparing for this conversation, perhaps for months, and had already decided how he would handle it. "Start with the Children's Future Foundation," Maria replied, lifting one of the printed emails. "Explain to me how a charity that supposedly helps disadvantaged children sent you a thank you note specifically mentioning legal representation for custody modifications involving college-age students." David leaned back in the chair that had been his sanctuary for 8 years, the place where he'd built his reputation as a respected family law attorney while apparently orchestrating elaborate deceptions against his own wife. His expression remained neutral, professional, as if Maria were opposing counsel presenting evidence rather than his betrayed spouse demanding explanations. "The Children's Future Foundation is a legitimate nonprofit organization that provides legal services to families navigating complex custody situations," he said. "Their mission is to ensure that children's interests are protected when their parents are involved in ongoing legal disputes about support, visitation, or educational expenses. My donations help fund that important work." Maria felt a flash of admiration for David's ability to present a technically truthful explanation that completely avoided the actual question. But she was no longer the trusting wife who could be distracted back to l'extraction. "David," she said firmly, "I know that your donations coincide perfectly with your visits to see Marcus. I know that these organizations specialize in providing legal representation to divorced parents, specifically ex-wives seeking modifications to custody and support agreements. I know that you've donated over $200,000 of our joint assets to fund legal services that benefit Natasha. And I know that you've structured these transactions to provide yourself with tax deductions while hiding them from me." The litany of accusations hung in the air between them, each one supported by documentation that David couldn't dispute or dismiss. Maria watched his face for signs of surprise, denial, or anger, but saw only a kind of resigned calculation, as if he were deciding how much truth the situation demanded. "You're right," he said finally, "about all of it." The admission was so straightforward that Maria felt momentarily off balance, as if she'd been bracing for impact that never came. "I have been funding legal representation that benefits Natasha, and I should have discussed it with you from the beginning." Maria stared at her husband, trying to process his unexpected honesty. She'd prepared for denials, explanations, attempts to minimize or justify his actions. She hadn't prepared for complete acknowledgement of guilt, and the absence of defensive behavior left her uncertain how to proceed. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you pay for your ex-wife's legal costs in disputes against yourself? Why would you hide it from me? Why would you drain our savings to support someone who supposedly has no role in our marriage?" David stood up and moved to the window that looked out over their backyard, the garden Maria had planted when they'd first moved to the house, the patio where they'd hosted barbecues for Elena's friends, the swing set that had been Elena's 12th birthday present and now stood empty, waiting for grandchildren who might never come. "Because Marcus asked me to," David said quietly. "Because my son was watching his mother struggle with legal bills she couldn't afford, and he was feeling guilty about the cost of his Stanford education, and he was starting to talk about transferring to a state school to reduce the financial burden on both his parents." The explanation hit Maria like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on the possibility of ongoing romantic entanglement between David and his ex-wife that she hadn't considered the simpler, more devastating truth. David was willing to bankrupt their marriage to protect his relationship with his adult son. "Marcus came to me 2 years ago," David continued, still facing the window. "He was a sophomore at Stanford, and Natasha was struggling to pay for the legal representation she needed to modify our original custody agreement. The educational expenses weren't adequately covered in our divorce settlement, and she was facing the choice between hiring a competent attorney or asking Marcus to leave Stanford and attend a less expensive school." Maria felt the ground shifting beneath her understanding of her family's dynamics. Marcus had always been polite but distant during his interactions with her, the result of geographical separation and the natural awkwardness of blended family relationships. She'd assumed his reserve was simply teenage self-consciousness that would improve as he matured. The possibility that he'd been actively seeking David's financial support for his mother's legal battles had never occurred to her. So you decided to fund her attorney fees without discussing it with your current wife, Maria said. You decided to risk our financial security to protect your relationship with Marcus, and you structured it as charitable donations to hide what you were really doing. David turned from the window to face her directly, and Maria saw something in his expression that she'd rarely witnessed during their 12-year marriage: vulnerability. Not the calculated openness he used to manage difficult conversations, but genuine uncertainty about whether his explanations would be sufficient to preserve their relationship. "I knew you wouldn't understand," he said. "I knew you'd see it as choosing Marcus over you, or supporting Natasha at the expense of our family. But Maria, Marcus is my son. He's the only child I'll ever have who carries my genetic legacy, who represents my connection to future generations. Elena is wonderful, and I love her as my own daughter, but she's not biologically mine. Marcus is." The distinction hit Maria with the force of a revelation she'd never wanted to receive. In 12 years of marriage, David had never explicitly differentiated between his love for Marcus and his love for Elena. He'd been careful to treat both children with apparent equality, to avoid any suggestion that biology created different categories of parental commitment. But when forced to choose between financial commitments, the deeper truth had emerged. Marcus's needs would always take precedence over Elena's security. "You mortgaged our daughter's future to protect your son's college experience," Maria said, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "You compromised Elena's inheritance, her college fund, her financial security to make sure Marcus didn't have to transfer from Stanford to a state school." David's face flushed with the first sign of genuine emotion she'd seen since the conversation began. "It wasn't that simple," he said. "Marcus isn't just my son, he's an extraordinarily gifted young man who's been accepted to graduate programs at Harvard and MIT. His potential contributions to society could be enormous, but only if he receives the kind of education that places like Stanford provide. Elena is bright and capable, but she's not operating at Marcus's intellectual level." The casual dismissal of Elena's potential felt like a slap across Maria's face. Her daughter, who spoke 3 languages fluently, who'd been accepted to every university she'd applied to, who was currently thriving in one of the most competitive international exchange programs available to American students, was being characterized as intellectually inferior to David's biological son. "So Elena doesn't deserve the same financial investment because she's not as brilliant as Marcus?" Maria asked. "Or because she's not biologically yours?" David's silence was answer enough. The man who'd claimed to love Elena as his own daughter, who'd attended her school plays and soccer games, who'd taught her to drive and helped her with college applications, had never considered her worthy of the same sacrifices he was willing to make for Marcus. Maria stood up from David's desk and walked to the filing cabinet where he kept their important documents. She knew the combination to the lock because David had given it to her years ago, during a period when they'd briefly attempted to share financial responsibilities more equally. Inside the cabinet were their wills, their insurance policies, their retirement account statements, and their tax returns from the previous 5 years. She pulled out their most recent tax return and spread it on the desk next to the evidence of David's charitable donations. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the line that showed their total charitable deductions. $47,000 in donations last year, David, almost as much as my entire teaching salary, claimed as tax deductions on our joint return, reducing our tax liability and putting more money in our pockets while you funneled our savings to your ex-wife's attorneys." The financial implications were staggering. David had not only used their joint assets to support his ex-wife's legal costs, he'd structured the transactions to provide maximum tax benefits, effectively making Maria complicit in funding Natasha's legal representation against David himself. Every tax refund they'd received, every reduction in their tax liability, had been partially the result of charitable donations that Maria had known nothing about. But the tax implications were secondary to the deeper betrayal that was becoming clear as Maria examined their financial records more carefully. David had been systematically preparing for the possibility that his deceptions would be discovered and his marriage would end. He'd moved assets into accounts bearing only his name, reduced his contributions to their joint retirement funds, and minimized his investments in their shared property. "David," she said, looking at a statement from an investment account she'd never known existed, "you've been preparing for divorce while funding your ex-wife's legal representation. You've been protecting your relationship with Marcus while undermining your commitment to our marriage. David returned to his chair across from her, his expression now showing signs of the strain that came from maintaining professional composure while his personal life disintegrated. Maria, he said carefully, I've been trying to balance competing obligations and conflicting loyalties. I love you and Elena, and I want our marriage to succeed, but I also have responsibilities to Marcus that predate our relationship and will continue regardless of what happens between us. The clinical language felt like another betrayal, as if David were reducing their marriage to a case study in competing legal claims rather than acknowledging the emotional devastation his deceptions had caused. But Maria realized that his professional detachment was probably the only way he could function while systematically dismantling the financial foundation of their family. How much more, she asked, how much more money have you moved into accounts I can't access? How much more have you donated to organizations that benefit your ex-wife? How much more financial damage have you done to our marriage while pretending to be committed to our partnership?
David opened his laptop and pulled up financial records that painted an even more disturbing picture of systematic deception. The charitable donations were only part of his strategy for supporting Marcus and Natasha while preparing for the potential end of his marriage to Maria. He'd also been contributing to an education fund that would cover Marcus's graduate school expenses, making direct payments to Natasha for various emergencies, and building a separate retirement account that would provide him with financial independence if his marriage collapsed. The total amount diverted from their joint assets approached $400,000 over 2.5 years, money that had been accumulated during their marriage and should have been considered community property in any divorce proceeding. David's legal expertise had allowed him to structure these transactions in ways that would be difficult for Maria to challenge, even with competent representation. Maria stared at the financial records spread across David's desk and tried to calculate what their marriage had actually cost her. Not just the emotional investment of 12 years, but the opportunity costs of career choices made in support of a partnership that had been built on systematic deception. She'd turned down opportunities for advancement that would have required relocation, had avoided pursuing her doctoral degree because it would have created financial strain, had accepted lower-paying positions that allowed her to be available for Elena's school events and David's social obligations. The life she'd built around supporting David's career and maintaining their household had been subsidizing his ongoing financial relationship with his ex-wife while he prepared for the possibility of ending their marriage. Every sacrifice she'd made, every compromise she'd accepted, had been enabling his betrayal of the partnership she'd thought they were building together. David, Maria said, looking directly into his eyes, I need to ask you one more question, and I need you to answer with complete honesty. Are you still in love with Natasha? The question seemed to surprise him more than anything else she'd asked. After a long moment, he shook his head slowly. No, he said, I'm not in love with Natasha, and I haven't been for many years. Our marriage ended because we discovered we weren't compatible as partners, and that fundamental incompatibility hasn't changed. Then why, Maria asked, why risk everything we've built together for someone you don't love? Why compromise our marriage, our financial security, our daughter's future, for a woman you divorced 15 years ago? David was quiet for so long that Maria wondered if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to come from years of internal struggle he'd never shared with anyone. Because Marcus needed me to, he said simply. Because my son asked me to take care of his mother, and I couldn't refuse him. Because the relationship I have with Marcus is the most important thing in my life, more important than our marriage, more important than my professional reputation, more than anything else I've ever accomplished. The admission was devastating in its honesty. David wasn't supporting his ex-wife out of lingering romantic attachment or emotional dependency. He was doing it because his relationship with his biological son took precedence over every other commitment in his life, including his marriage to Maria. Maria felt something break inside her, not the sharp pain of betrayal, but the dull ache of understanding that her marriage had been built on a fundamental lie.
David had never truly committed to their partnership because he'd never stopped prioritizing his previous family. She'd been competing with ghosts for 12 years, trying to build a life with someone who'd already decided that his ultimate loyalty belonged elsewhere. She stood up from David's desk and began gathering the financial documents and printed emails she'd used to confront him. The evidence of his deceptions would be useful in divorce proceedings, but keeping it felt less important than simply removing herself from the office where she'd discovered the full scope of his betrayal. "Where are you going?" David asked as she moved toward the door. "I'm going to call Elena," Maria replied. "I'm going to tell our daughter that her college fund has been spent supporting her stepbrother's education, and that her stepfather has been systematically preparing for the end of our marriage while pretending to be committed to our family." David stood up quickly, his composure finally cracking. "Maria, please, don't involve Elena in this. She doesn't need to know about the financial details or the problems between us. This can stay between you and me." The request felt like another manifestation of David's need to control information and manage perceptions. He'd spent years hiding his deceptions from Maria, and now he wanted to hide the consequences from Elena. "But Maria is 16 years old, David," she said. "She's not a child who needs to be protected from the reality of our family situation. She's a young woman who deserves to know that her stepfather has compromised her future to support his biological son, and that her mother is considering divorce because of his financial deceptions." The mention of divorce seemed to hit David like a physical blow. "You're filing for divorce?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Over charitable donations? Over money I gave to help families with legal problems?" Maria stopped in the doorway and turned to face him one last time. "I'm considering divorce because you've spent 2.5 years systematically lying to me about fundamental aspects of our marriage, because you've compromised our financial security to support relationships you've hidden from me, because you've demonstrated that your commitment to Marcus and Natasha takes precedence over your responsibilities to Elena and me, because you've prepared for the end of our marriage while pretending to be working toward its success." The list of betrayals felt endless, each one building on the others, to create a pattern of deception that had undermined everything Maria had believed about their partnership. But the final betrayal was perhaps the most devastating. David's casual assumption that she would accept his explanations and continue their marriage as if nothing fundamental had changed between them. "You've made it clear that Marcus will always be your first priority," Maria continued, "that your biological son's needs will always take precedence over your stepdaughter's security, that your ex-wife's welfare matters more to you than your current wife's trust. I can't compete with that level of divided loyalty, and I won't spend the rest of my life wondering what other deceptions you're hiding from me." David crossed the office toward her, his hands extended in a gesture of supplication that felt both genuine and manipulative. "Maria, please, let's talk about this rationally. We can work out a system where I support Marcus without hiding it from you. We can restructure our finances to ensure Elena's security while still helping Natasha with legal costs. We can rebuild trust through complete transparency about all my financial commitments." David crossed the office toward her, his hands extended in a gesture of supplication that felt both genuine and manipulative. "Maria, please, let's talk about this rationally. We can work out a system where I support Marcus without hiding it from you. We can restructure our finances to ensure Elena's security while still helping Natasha with legal costs. We can rebuild trust through complete transparency about all my financial commitments." The proposal sounded reasonable, the kind of compromises that might be possible between partners who had simply disagreed about priorities, rather than between a husband who had systematically deceived his wife for years. But Maria realized that David's willingness to negotiate was probably just another form of management, an attempt to minimize the consequences of his betrayal without actually addressing its fundamental causes. "David," she said, stepping back from his outstretched hands, "the problem isn't that you support Marcus. The problem is that you've been lying to me about it for 2.5 years. The problem is that you've structured your deceptions to provide you with tax benefits while compromising our family's financial security. The problem is that you've been preparing for divorce while assuring me of your commitment to our marriage. But most importantly, she continued, the problem is that I can't trust you anymore. I can't trust that you're telling me the truth about our finances, about your relationship with your ex-wife, about your long-term commitment to our partnership. I can't trust that you won't prioritize Marcus's needs over Elena's security, or that you won't make major financial decisions without consulting me, or that you won't hide things from me when you think I won't understand or approve. The weight of broken trust felt heavier than the financial betrayal, more permanent than the compromised security of their shared assets. Maria had spent 12 years building her life around a belief that she and David were partners in every meaningful sense, that they shared values and priorities and commitment to their family's welfare. The discovery that David had been systematically deceiving her about fundamental aspects of their relationship had shattered not just her trust in him, but her confidence in her own judgment about the people closest to her. I'm going to stay at Carmen's tonight, she said. Tomorrow, I'm calling a divorce attorney to discuss my options. You should probably call your own attorney and start thinking about how you want to handle custody arrangements for Elena, property division, and spousal support. The practical considerations felt surreal even as she spoke them. 12 years of marriage reduced to legal procedures and financial calculations, a partnership dissolved into competing claims on shared assets and parenting responsibilities. But Maria realized that the legal dissolution would simply formalize what David's deceptions had already accomplished, the end of their marriage as a meaningful partnership built on mutual trust and shared commitment. David followed her to the front door, his desperation becoming more apparent as the reality of her leaving set in. "Maria, please don't do this," he said. "Don't throw away 12 years of marriage over money. Don't break up our family because I made some mistakes in managing our finances." Maria turned to face him one final time, standing in the doorway of the home they'd shared for 8 years, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together. The family photos on the hallway table, the artwork Alana had created in middle school, the comfortable furniture they'd chosen together during happier times when they'd believed they were building something permanent and meaningful. "This isn't about money, David," she said quietly. "This is about honesty, about trust, about the kind of partnership I thought we had, and the kind of partnership you've demonstrated we actually have. I can't stay married to someone who's been systematically lying to me while preparing for our divorce. I can't rebuild trust with someone who's willing to compromise our daughter's future to protect his relationship with his ex-wife and his biological son." She paused at the threshold, looking back at the man she'd loved and trusted for over a decade, trying to reconcile the David she'd married with the stranger who'd been revealed by his financial deceptions. "I hope you and Marcus and Natasha are happy with the choices you've made," she said. "I hope the money you've spent on their legal representation has been worth the cost of our marriage." Maria walked to her car without looking back, carrying only her purse and the folder of evidence that documented David's betrayal. Behind her, she could hear him calling her name, but his voice seemed to come from a great distance, as if he were already part of a past she was leaving behind, rather than a present she needed to navigate. The drive to Carmen's house took her through neighborhoods where she and David had walked on weekend mornings, past restaurants where they'd celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, beyond the school where she taught and where David had attended Elena's performances and parent-teacher conferences. Every familiar landmark felt like a memorial to a marriage that had ended not with dramatic confrontation or explosive revelation, but with the quiet devastation of discovering that the person she'd trusted most had been systematically deceiving her for years. Carmen was waiting, with wine and tissues, and the kind of practical support that comes from someone who'd navigated her own divorce and understood the complex emotions involved in dissolving a long-term marriage. They spent the evening reviewing Maria's legal options and discussing the practical considerations of separating a life that had been intertwined for over a decade. But underneath the logistical planning, Maria felt a strange sense of relief mixed with her grief. The uncertainty that had been building for months, the growing sense that something fundamental was wrong with her marriage, had finally been resolved. David's deceptions were devastating, but they were also liberating in their clarity. She no longer had to wonder why she felt like an outsider in her own marriage, why financial discussions felt evasive and incomplete, why David's commitment to their partnership sometimes felt conditional and temporary. The The next morning, Maria called Elena in Barcelona, waking her daughter at dawn, Spanish time, to deliver news that would fundamentally alter their family's trajectory. Elena's initial shock gave way to anger, then to a kind of fierce protectiveness that reminded Maria of her own strength and resilience. "Mom," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tears Maria could hear in her breathing, "I'm so sorry this happened to you, but I'm also proud of you for finding out the truth and for standing up for yourself. You deserve so much better than someone who would lie to you and steal from our family to help his ex-wife." The conversation with Elena crystallized something that had been forming in Maria's mind since she'd left David the night before. This divorce wasn't just about ending a marriage that had become untenable. It was about reclaiming her agency and self-respect after years of accepting deceptions and manipulations that had gradually eroded her confidence in her own perceptions and judgment. David had spent 2.5 years training her not to ask questions about their finances, not to probe too deeply into his charitable activities, not to challenge his decisions about their family's priorities. He'd made her complicit in her own diminishment, and the discovery of his deceptions had revealed not just his betrayal, but her own willingness to accept reassurances that weren't supported by evidence. Maria spent the following weeks methodically dismantling the life she'd built around supporting David's career and maintaining their household. She consulted with attorneys, reorganized her finances, and began the process of establishing her independence from a marriage that had been subsidizing her husband's ongoing relationship with his previous family. The legal proceedings were complex but not contentious. David's attempts to minimize the financial impact of his deceptions were undermined by the documentation Maria had gathered, and his attorney advised him to accept a settlement that provided Maria with a substantial portion of their joint assets, along with ongoing support payments that would allow her to maintain her standard of living. But the most significant victory came when Elena decided to return from Barcelona early, cutting short her exchange program to support her mother during the divorce proceedings. The girl who had been characterized as intellectually inferior to Marcus demonstrated wisdom and maturity that impressed even David's attorney, and her clear support for Maria's position helped solidify the custody arrangements that would allow them to remain together as a family unit. 6 months after confronting David in his office, Maria stood in the kitchen of her new apartment, making coffee for one and planning lessons for her students at the private school where she'd accepted a teaching position that paid nearly twice her previous salary. The job had required additional qualifications that she'd pursued during the divorce proceedings, using her sudden abundance of free time to earn certifications that expanded her professional options and increased her earning potential. Elena, now back from Barcelona, enrolled in her senior year of high school, emerged from her bedroom dressed for her part-time job at the local bookstore, a position she'd taken to earn money for college expenses and to demonstrate her independence from David's financial support. "How are you feeling about the settlement meeting today?" Elena asked, settling at the breakfast bar with her own cup of coffee. The final divorce hearing was scheduled for that afternoon, a formality that would officially end Maria's marriage to David and establish the terms of their post-divorce relationship. "Relieved," Maria replied honestly, "ready to have it finished and move forward with our lives." Elena nodded, then reached across the counter to squeeze her mother's hand. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said, "for finding out the truth, for standing up to David, for not letting him continue to lie to you and steal from us." The theft characterization might have seemed harsh to outside observers, but Maria and Elena had decided that David's use of their joint assets to fund his ex-wife's legal representation without disclosure constituted a form of financial betrayal that deserved the strongest possible condemnation. The charitable donations had been structured to provide David with tax benefits while compromising their family's security, making the deception both personally and financially devastating.
But even more significant than the financial betrayal was the psychological manipulation that had accompanied it. David had spent years conditioning Maria to accept his superior judgment about their finances, while systematically deceiving her about fundamental aspects of their partnership. He'd made her complicit in her own diminishment, training her not to ask questions that might have revealed his deceptions months or years earlier. The divorce had been painful, but it had also been educational in ways that strengthened Maria's confidence in her own judgment and decision-making abilities. She'd discovered that she was capable of sophisticated financial analysis, strategic thinking, and the kind of determined investigation that had exposed David's elaborate system of deceptions. She'd learned that her instincts about their marriage's problems had been accurate, even when David's professional skills had made her doubt her own perceptions. At the settlement meeting, David appeared subdued and professionally courteous, accepting the terms that would provide Maria with financial security while requiring him to establish clear boundaries around his ongoing support from Marcus and Natasha. He'd been required to disclose all his financial commitments and obtain Maria's written consent before making any charitable donations above a specified threshold, conditions that would prevent him from deceiving future partners the way he'd deceived her. The most satisfying moment came when David's attorney presented documents showing that the Children's Future Foundation and several related organizations had been investigated by state regulators for their role in facilitating undisclosed financial transfers between divorced parties. The system that David had used to hide his support for his ex-wife had been shut down, and several attorneys had been sanctioned for their participation in arrangements that violated ethics rules about client confidentiality and financial transparency. After the hearing, Maria and Elena celebrated at their favorite restaurant, toasting not just the end of a difficult chapter, but the beginning of what felt like a more authentic and self-directed future. Maria had been accepted to a doctoral program that would allow her to continue teaching while pursuing advanced credentials in educational administration. Elena had been offered early admission to 3 universities with scholarship packages that would cover most of her expenses without requiring David's financial contributions. The conversation turned, as it often did, to the lessons they'd learned from David's deceptions and the divorce that had followed. Elena was particularly interested in understanding how someone could maintain elaborate lies for years while appearing to be a loving and committed family member. "I think," Maria said, considering the question carefully, "David convinced himself that his deceptions were justified because they were protecting people he cared about. He was helping Marcus, supporting Natasha, maintaining family relationships that were important to him. The lying was just a tool he used to avoid conflict and manage competing demands on his loyalty and resources." "But," Elena pointed out, "he wasn't protecting you and me. His deceptions compromised our financial security and destroyed trust in our family. So he was choosing which people deserved protection and which people could be sacrificed for his priorities." The insight was profound and disturbing, highlighting the way David had compartmentalized his moral obligations to justify behavior that served his own interests while causing harm to others. He'd prioritized his relationship with Marcus over his responsibilities to Elena, his desire to support Natasha over his commitment to honesty with Maria, his need to avoid conflict over the trust that should have been foundational to their marriage. But perhaps most troubling was David's assumption that Maria would accept his explanations and continue their marriage once his deceptions were revealed. He'd seemed genuinely surprised by her decision to file for divorce, as if systematic financial betrayal was something a reasonable wife should be willing to overlook in the interest of maintaining family stability. The assumption reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what marriage meant to Maria, and probably to most people who entered partnerships expecting mutual respect and shared decision-making. David had treated their marriage as a hierarchy where his judgment took precedence over her concerns, where his financial decisions could be made unilaterally as long as they were dressed up as charitable activities, where her role was to trust and support rather than to participate as an equal partner. The divorce had been Maria's way of rejecting that hierarchical model and insisting on her right to full disclosure and genuine partnership in any future relationship. It had also been her way of demonstrating to Elena that women didn't have to accept deception and financial manipulation as the price of family stability. 6 months later, Maria received an unexpected phone call from Patricia, the librarian who had helped her research David's charitable organizations during the early stages of her investigation. 2 other women had contacted the library seeking similar assistance in documenting their husbands' suspicious charitable activities, and Patricia wondered if Maria would be willing to speak with them about her experience. The conversation with the other wives revealed a pattern that was more common than Maria had realized. Professional men, particularly attorneys and accountants who understood financial systems and tax regulations, were using charitable donations to disguise ongoing financial relationships with ex-wives while claiming tax deductions and maintaining their reputations for generosity.
The wives who discovered these deceptions were often educated, financially sophisticated women who had been gradually trained not to question their husband's superior expertise in managing their family's finances. Maria agreed to serve as a resource for other women navigating similar discoveries, sharing the investigation techniques she'd developed and the legal strategies that had been effective in her own case. The work felt like a natural extension of her teaching career, helping people develop critical thinking skills and confidence in their own analytical abilities. The most rewarding aspect of this informal consulting was watching other women discover their own competence and strength in the process of uncovering their husband's deceptions. Like Maria, many of them had been convinced that they lacked the sophistication to understand complex financial arrangements, when in fact they'd simply been systematically excluded from information that would have revealed their partner's betrayals. Elena, now finishing her freshman year at college with a double major in international relations and economics, often helped Maria with research for these cases. The experience had given Elena insights into financial manipulation and relationship dynamics that would serve her well in her own future partnerships, while reinforcing her determination never to accept the kind of systematic deception that had characterized her mother's marriage to David. The work also provided Maria with a sense of purpose that extended beyond her own recovery from divorce. She was helping other women reclaim their agency and self-respect after years of accepting reassurances that weren't supported by evidence. She was demonstrating that wives didn't have to remain ignorant about their family's financial situations, and that charitable giving could be a cover for deceptions that undermined marriage partnerships. Most importantly, she was showing other women that they could survive and thrive after discovering that their marriages had been built on systematic lies. The divorce, that had initially felt like a devastating failure, had become the foundation for a more authentic and self-directed life. Proof that ending a deceptive relationship could be the beginning of genuine partnership with someone who valued honesty and transparency. 3 years after her confrontation with David in his home office, Maria stood in her own office at the private school where she now served as assistant principal, reviewing applications for a scholarship fund she'd established to support children whose families had been disrupted by divorce. The fund was supported by donations from women who had successfully navigated their own divorces from financially deceptive husbands, creating a network of mutual support that extended far beyond individual cases. Elena called from her study abroad program in Geneva, where she was completing an internship with an international organization focused on financial transparency and anti-corruption efforts. The work was directly inspired by her mother's experience with David's deceptions, and Elena had developed expertise in detecting and documenting the kind of financial manipulation that had characterized her stepfather's approach to charitable giving. "Mom," Elena said, her voice bright with excitement, "I wanted to tell you about a case we're working on here. It's a wealthy businessman who's been using fake charities to hide assets from his wife during their divorce proceedings. The techniques are almost identical to what David was doing, but on an international scale." The conversation reinforced Maria's growing understanding that David's deceptions had been part of a larger pattern of financial manipulation that affected families around the world. Men with access to professional expertise and sophisticated financial systems were using their knowledge to deceive their partners while maintaining public reputations for integrity and generosity. But Maria had also learned that these deceptions could be detected and documented by determined individuals who were willing to ask questions and demand transparency. The women she'd worked with had developed investigative skills that rivaled those of professional forensic accountants, and their success in uncovering their husbands' lies had inspired others to examine their own relationships more critically. The scholarship fund had grown to support over 50 students annually, providing educational opportunities for children whose families had been destabilized by financial deceptions similar to David's. Many of the recipients were children of the women Maria had advised, young people who had learned valuable lessons about integrity and transparency from watching their mothers navigate complex divorce proceedings. The most recent scholarship recipient was Marcus, David's son, who had contacted Maria after learning about the fund through his father's professional network. Marcus had graduated from Stanford and been accepted to graduate school at MIT, but he'd also developed a sophisticated understanding of the financial manipulation his father had used to support his education at the expense of Maria and Elena's security. The scholarship application included a personal statement in which Marcus acknowledged the harm his father's deceptions had caused and expressed his commitment to using his education in ways that promoted financial transparency and ethical business practices. The maturity and self-awareness in his statement had impressed the scholarship committee and led to his selection despite the complicated history between his father and Maria. Elena had initially opposed supporting Marcus's graduate education, arguing that he'd been the primary beneficiary of David's financial deceptions and shouldn't receive a